In the last video, I mentioned the lack of agreement on what constitutes digital humanities and what does not. This course and this lecture series will introduce you to a number of ambiguous terms that you will need to learn how to explain and define. Somebody famous once said, "Only that which has no history is definable." Many terms change or acquire new meanings over time, but these changes occur in context and by the people and communities who use these terms. As DH specialists, you must learn how major scholars in the field define and understand the digital humanities, both in theory and in practice, and develop your own understanding of it. The hazy term I will introduce today is distant reading. Distant reading is one of the most commonly associated terms with DH, and it is also one of the most misunderstood and misused terms. The term originates from Stanford professor Franco Moretti's provocative article Conjectures on World Literature, which was published in New Left Review in 2000. According to Google Scholar, this article has been cited more than 3,000 times. Unfortunately, many of those citations simply credit Moretti for coining the term distant reading without engaging with the article's contents. As DH specialists, you need to read Moretti's article and develop your own take of how Moretti used the term originally and define and understand distant reading in your own terms. To give you a spoiler, distant reading is not the same thing as macro-level data analysis or macro analysis. Before I begin, I'd like to mention that I am not a trained literary scholar. I am a medieval historian of East Asia with an interest in literary history and literary criticism. But on several occasions, I read Moretti with linguists and literary scholars. What I will discuss today is a portion of my understanding of Moretti, as well as some issues in the piece that deserve special attention. I strongly encourage everyone to read the article, which is free to read online by clicking on the link in the video description. The first thing you should notice about Moretti's Conjectures on World Literature is that it was written with a political agenda in mind, specifically a New Left intellectual agenda. It is not intended to be a formal academic piece, but rather a provocative piece written in a relatively playful tone. Second, the idea of distant reading was inspired by Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory and the Annales school of French historians. Following world systems theory, Moretti divides the world of literature into core, semi-periphery, and periphery. Wallerstein's capital flows are simply replaced by the authority to define the world literature canon and the influences of core countries of semi-peripheral and peripheral countries with respect to their literary traditions. If you're starting to feel uneasy about this framing, you're not alone. Moretti borrows the idea of adapting some aspects of scientific methods in a humanities discipline from the Annales school, specifically historians Marc Bloch and Fernand Braudel. This is not always made explicit in the article, and you will find only a reference to Bloch's quote, "Years of analysis for a day of synthesis." I would like you to consider the implications of this saying with respect to distant reading. The Annales school advocated and practiced a highly interdisciplinary approach to historical research. While they were skeptical of the existence of natural laws in history, they looked for what they called regularities or repetitive patterns in historical records. Their systemic and structural investigation entailed a dynamic manipulation of historical time. As a general rule, they analyzed and interpreted the past in terms of three temporal units: événement, or events, measured in units of at most several years; conjoncture, or combination of events measured in decades; and finally, the most famous term, longue durée, or long-term structures that can be only observed across centuries. This scale manipulation was also used in space. Braudel was known for his geohistory of the Mediterranean world, and his successor, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, focused on a microhistorical study of a French village. Moretti's Conjectures on World Literature was written several years after the publication of an experimental book titled Atlas of the European Novel. There are many maps in this book that we would now call data visualizations. However, there are no references to digital technologies, computing, or digital humanities in this book. The similarities are with annals historians, who are also fond of mapping data points and visualizing quantitative data. So what does Moretti hope to achieve with distant reading? Let's look at two statements made by Moretti in the article. The first one, we know how to read texts. Now let's learn how not to read them. Distant reading, where distance, let me repeat it, is a condition of knowledge. It allows you to focus on units that are much smaller or much larger than the text. Devices, themes, tropes, or genres and systems. The second, between the very small and the very large, the text itself disappears. The term distant reading refers to a disconnection from the subjects, which in this case are texts that constitute literary works and literary masterpieces. Distance, or disconnection, can be created in two ways: by zooming out to units much larger than text, or by breaking down the text into smaller pieces, such as literary devices, themes, tropes, or, in the case of modern natural language processing, tokens, features, parts of speech tags, and vectors. The idea is to alternate between the very small and the very large so that the text vanishes and we gain insights by not being preoccupied with reading the texts themselves. In DH and information science, the software and algorithms designed for multi-scale explorations of text and other data types are called a microscope. Not microscope, macroscope. More on this in a future video. The goal of distant reading is to explore alternative modes of approaching world literature through playful manipulation of scale. As Moretti says, the beauty of distant reading plus world literature, they go against the grain of national historiography, and they do so in the form of an experiment. The meaning of experiment here is not experiment in the scientific sense, but being experimental. The article itself is a series of conjectures and thought experiments involving the metaphors of trees and waves. In 2005, Moretti published his famous book, Graphs, Maps, Trees, and dropped wave theory to demonstrate distant reading as he understands it. It's worth noting that neither Conjectures on World Literature nor Graphs, Maps, Trees mention digital humanities or use computational methods. Before closing, I encourage you to read Moretti's article and consider carefully what Moretti means by world literature. Does Moretti's world literature include the Chinese poet Du Fu? Or India's Mahabharata? What does Moretti mean by his triangle of foreign form, local material, and local form? Or foreign plot, local characters, and then local narrative voice? What's your take on Moretti? Share your thoughts in the comment section below, or if you're an HKU HTT student, bring your questions and comments to our distant reading class session. That's all for today. Until next time.